From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
It's an office party for Elon. Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power as Elon Musk marks his last day as the leader of the DOGE with a send-off in the Oval Office, complete with a presidential news conference. I'm Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz at World Headquarters in New York. Welcome to the program on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kailey, this is all set to happen this hour, and I suspect could go in a lot of directions.
Well, yeah, not just about the DOGE or about Elon Musk's service to the Trump administration and U.S. government, but I would imagine the president's going to have some questions to answer on a few different issues, including what exactly he meant when he True Social posted earlier today that China is not sticking to its trade deal with the U.S. No more Mr. Nice Guy is what he said. He just didn't really get more specific than that, Joe.
No more Mr. Nice Guy. Big questions about the impact of the DOGE. What do the receipts actually show versus the promise? And the deep dive in the New York Times today, the expose on Elon Musk's lifestyle, could all add up to quite a romp with reporters. Of course, they're framing this as a news conference. I'm assuming there will be questions.
I'm assuming as well. And of course, this isn't the only time we're going to hear from the president today. Is at 5 o'clock in the late edition of Balance of Power. He has scheduled an appearance at a U.S. Steel facility outside Pittsburgh, where he's going to talk about that Nippon Steel deal. Maybe we'll get some actual details as to what it entails. Is it a partnership or is it a takeover? We're all going to find out together later this evening. I would imagine that could go in a lot of different directions as well. Just like this market is going in a decidedly different direction after we got some news on a China tech sanctions crackdown expanding to subsidiaries. So let's check in on those markets now. Charlie Pellet's here with us in New York.
Thank you very much, Kailey Leinz. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all declining. You mentioned U.S. Steel ahead of the big announcement today. U.S. Steel right now up by about 0.6%. Under 3 hours to go until we wrap up the trading month of May with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all very much in the red. Trade and tariffs front and center again today. A solid month for stocks ending on a weak note as President Trump says Beijing, quote, totally violated a tariff agreement, with the market extending losses on a news report that the U.S. does plan to broaden restrictions on China's tech sector. Here's where we stand, very close to lows of the day right now, with the S&P down 54, drop there of 0.9%. Dow Industrials down 205, down 0.5. NASDAQ Composite Index down 292, a drop there of 1.5%. The Bloomberg Mag 7 Index down 2.1%. Tech being hit hard today. The 10-year 4.39%, with the 2-year 3.89%. Gold now down $25 the ounce, down by about 0.8%. West Texas Intermediate crude just above $60 a barrel, slumping today by 1%. And Bitcoin now lower by 2%, 104,011 on Bitcoin. Palantir shares pushing higher, putting the stock on track for a record close after the New York Times reported that the Trump administration has expanded the data analysis software company's work across the federal government in recent months. Palantir shares right now, they are trading higher on a down day for the rest of the market. Palantir right now up by 1.7%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to our New York studio. Yes, they're here in New York. Once again, Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Here in New York for the last day before we have to head back to Washington, which will be the center of all of our attention, scheduled half an hour from now. I guess it's always our center of attention for Mathieu and myself, but especially when you have the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, set to give a joint press conference together. This could get interesting. 1:30 p.m. is when it's supposed to kick off. We'll see how much we stick to that timing, but we know what it'll be about, Joe, and it's about the DOGE.
Is X going?
That's my question. He's at the White House a lot.
I have big questions about the optics here. Is he standing next to the desk with the president sitting? Do we have podiums in the Oval Office? It's a curious venue
What
for
hat
an
will
event
Elon
like
be
this.
wearing?
What hat will he wear, and will actual questions be, taken by reporters? So like you said, it's set for 1:30, probably not on time, as few things are at the White House, no matter who seems to be living there. But when it begins, we'll bring it to you live, of course, right here on Bloomberg. Then we reel into the 5 o'clock speech at U.S. Steel, Kailey. That's being billed as a big rally and could keep us up a little bit later than usual tonight.
Yeah, he has a tendency to speak for a while at these kind of things. And we assume that we're going to get more details about the U.S. Steel-Nippon partnership or deal, whatever it is, if the United States is getting a golden share in this and will still have full control over this company or not, knowing that there does seem to have been a tone shift between campaign Donald Trump, who said this needs to stay in U.S. hands. No way this deal can go forward, versus President Trump, who is much more open to this idea after the CFIUS review.
We talked to Stephen Myron about this a couple of days ago on Balance of Power and asked him about the terminology here, and he didn't seem to care as long as the jobs were preserved and the jobs added, the investment dollars were made. But this idea of a golden share has got our attention, and I suspect we'll hear about that later from the president. Joe Deaux is watching all of this from his perch at Bloomberg, our metals and mining reporter with his eyes on U.S. Steel. Joe, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Balance of Power here on Bloomberg. Can you tell us what you understand about the structure? Because this sure looks like a takeover, at least when you look at the dollars involved here, and not unlike the deals that had been proposed, to Kailey's point, not favored by Donald Trump or Joe Biden. But tonight he's going to be talking about a partnership and a company that the U.S. government will help control. How does it work?
Yeah, Joe, that is the question. What is the structure of whatever this deal is? And I think we're still a bit in the dark. We're maybe starting to see some bits and pieces flow out. Of course, earlier this week, one of the senators here from Pennsylvania had mentioned the $14 billion supposedly being invested by Nippon Steel into U.S. Steel. But I think, listen, the investor class is watching very closely. They do want to know what this deal actually means. The golden share, let's think of it more like a mitigation agreement, right? That's the national security agreement. Golden share, I don't know if it's actually a golden share. That might just be branding. But the point here is, what is the United States federal government place going to be in this entire thing? Are they going to have veto powers over how much production can be shut down or not shut down? Are they going to have veto powers over jobs? How many can be cut in bad times and good times, right? I mean, right now, all we're talking about is, does this deal get done or not? But after the deal is supposedly done, this goes back to being a steel company. And steel companies are still commodity companies that go with the ups and downs of the market.
Well, that's very true. And of course, it being a steel company is why, initially at least, President Trump, like President Biden before him, was opposed to this deal, because they said there's great national security implications and interest the United States has in retaining its own steel production capacity. I want to ask you about a different element of the commodity space, though, specifically critical minerals, Joe, because President Trump today was talking about China not abiding by the terms agreed to in Geneva in regard to the trade agreement. The USTR Jameson Greer indicated that one of the big sticking points may be that critical minerals were not flowing in the way that China promised they would after they restricted them in retaliation for President Trump's very high tariffs. Do we have a sense of the critical minerals flow, what actually is happening?
You know, over the past 2 weeks, I've been in discussions with various people that are in this critical mineral space, the rare earth space, and they have indicated, you know, listen, it's not like anything drastically changed with the new trade deal. The new trade deal was very specific about companies that would have certain things lifted on them. But remember, the export controls that were implemented by China, I think this is what they're really getting at here, with these 7 rare earths that are implemented the day after the President of the United States mentioned the reciprocal tariffs. Those export controls went on every nation. It wasn't just the United States. So I think there's a procedural thing here that might be under discussion with Chinese officials and U.S. officials, which is this isn't just a U.S. thing, so it's not just a specific U.S. discussion. So right now, as we understand, it's not clear that these export controls have been lifted, but it's also not clear that it was ever agreed to in the beginning that they would be lifted in the way that the president seems to be suggesting.
All right, Joe Deaux, we appreciate it. Bloomberg Metals and Mining reporter, doing God's work, literally on the side of the road in Pennsylvania, where President Trump will be today with an umbrella in hand. Our audience on Bloomberg Radio is missing how hard Joe is working for us today, surviving the elements to cover this U.S. Steel visit that will be happening later. We really appreciate it. But of course, before we can get to U.S. Steel later this afternoon, we have to get through a joint press conference between President Trump and Elon Musk first. It's scheduled to begin just over 20 minutes from now, and we want to get into it with our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us. Rick, of course, is a Stonecourt Capital partner and Republican strategist. Jeanne, a Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. His days as a special government employee, Jeanne, are about to be over. They're going to talk about all of the work the DOGE has done over that time to shrink the size of the federal government. We do know thousands of people's lives have actually been affected by layoffs in the federal government, but it doesn't seem that the kind of money Elon Musk said he was going to save, he got anywhere close to actually saving. So what kind of victory lap is this really going to be?
You know, Kailey, I keep wondering, what does Donald Trump give him for a farewell address? Like a little chainsaw for his desk, or, I don't know, something like that. Coupons for free nights at the Lincoln Bedroom. I am so baffled by this because, of course, what Elon Musk is trying to do is to leave gracefully so that he can reconstruct his image and, of course, impact those sales in a positive way. To have a press conference now, I don't know how this helps him rehabilitate his image. But of course, the reality of DOGE is that the $2 trillion in cuts promised, by some calculations, people are saying, so let's say by Elon Musk's calculation, it was closer to 160 billion in the end. But other people are saying, in fact, DOGE cost money simply because of those IRS cuts to people that hurt the ability of the IRS to take in income. Either way you slice it, it is far less than he promised. And of course, they have a bill going to Congress now. But I am not convinced DOGE is going to live on beyond Elon Musk and his chainsaw.
Rick, how is this going to work, chainsaw or not? This is the Oval Office. The president's going to be sharing space with a non-elected official, not a world leader. Are they going to sit on the chairs in front of the fireplace like you've got a prime minister in town? Does he have Elon stand next to the desk? This could be awkward.
Well, we've seen White House, Oval Office events in where Elon stands next to the desk. In fact, even X usually gets standing room only treatment inside the Oval Office. And we've seen many occasions where Donald Trump would have people in his administration or from other countries come into the Oval Office and stand around the president's desk while he sat. So I think the physicality of this thing will be interesting to watch, right? Because I think there must be some pecking order for what treatment you get if you're on the good list or the bad list. Lately, the bad list is when you're sitting next to one another in the most formal posture.
How
and
true.
You get beat up. He's not going to attack Elon Musk. They'll be playful and they'll be interesting. They won't answer any of the questions that you want them to, but they see this as a long-standing relationship that will continue on. Elon Musk and the president say they'll continue to discuss the affairs of state. And yes, I do think this is part of what Elon Musk believes is his rehabilitation back to the private sector, where he can become popular again for the things that he's done to improve the country and the world, his inventions. And I think that would be the best outcome, is for the president of the United States to say, Elon Musk invents really cool things and I'm going to drive a Tesla and someday I'll go to Mars.
Remember when the Teslas were lined up outside the White House?
How could I forget?
Like a showroom.
Yeah.
We forget the things that have already happened in this administration. Rick, I do wonder, though, about your thoughts on what Jeanne was saying, which is that she doesn't believe that the DOGE effort lives beyond Elon Musk, knowing there was a DOGE caucus formed in Congress. There were lawmakers ready to take up this mantle as well, really pursue this effort to shrink the government. Does all of that just kind of fade to the wayside?
It's been a whirlwind in only a few months. DOGE went from basically running the entire federal government to being an asterisk. And I think that's the real question now, is not so much the Hill, because they like to do their own thing. And the DOGE caucus, I think, was just a way to fit into the narrative with Elon Musk being so powerful. But at the end of the day, you do have DOGE employees. They're sitting in these agencies. They are now under the thumbs of the cabinet secretaries, which happened even while Elon was there. And yet we do see active efforts on the part of this administration to implement IT reforms, including a very big contract for Palantir brought in by DOGE to basically start unifying databases throughout the government. So if you blink, you might miss it. But the reality is there is a pretty significant effort underway that could substantially change things like privacy and government access to your data and the integration of data through different databases that is going to be talked about for quite some time.
What does Elon Musk have really to celebrate when it comes to the DOGE today, Jeanne? Will it be cutting spending? Because the promise was $2 trillion on the way in, and it looks like $16 billion on the way out. when you consider the wall of receipts? Or will it be the fact that he took the chainsaw or the proverbial sledgehammer and started to destroy agencies like USAID, which was part of the aim of this administration?
You know, I think he is going to try to celebrate something that I don't think deserves celebrating. And I think you just heard it in Rick's answer. The promise was the $2 trillion in cuts you just talked about, Joe. The reality is far less, maybe 2 or 3%. Even again, some people saying it may cost taxpayers to have DOGE in there. But what this is going to cost us in addition to money is issues of privacy. And the contract that Rick was just talking about is a very good example. We don't know how this turns out at the end, but the outcome of this, I don't think, is going to be known as it pertains to our rights and liberties for a very long time. And what's frustrating and fascinating about this at the same time, under a GOP that has long been committed to a smaller federal government, they opened the door to private company to go in and take away some of the most valuable information that we treasure and people don't want being shared. So I do think that that is going to be likely the legacy, but I'm not sure it's the legacy that Elon Musk is going to celebrate. And I would also just add that nobody is going to miss Elon Musk more than Donald Trump, except for the Democrats. Mm-hmm. I mean, the real losers here with him leaving are the Democrats, who have enjoyed this enormously and would like nothing else more than for him to stay, so they can continue to beat up on him, as he said.
Yeah, Jeannie, what are they going to run on in 2026 if Elon Musk is no longer a daily fixture in Washington headlines?
Yeah, I mean, you don't get it better than the world's wealthiest man coming in to make cuts, fire people, cut cancer research, food assistance to the poor, AIDS research, AIDS funding. I mean, it was just, tailor-made for the Democrats. They're going to miss him enormously. They'll just have to look back wistfully at Wisconsin and be happy and proud that they control the Supreme Court, thanks to Elon Musk, probably.
This could be one of those events, Rick Davis, where Democrats are making ads for some time. If you were helping to prepare the president and Elon Musk to meet the press today, to what extent do they need to be on message?
Yeah, look, I mean, being on message in this administration is different than what I was taught how to be on message.
That's for sure.
And so, you would want them to say things that would actually appear in a Republican ad, not a Democratic ad. And that would require the discipline to say that they came to Washington to reduce the size and scope of government, its intrusion into your daily life, and that's what they've done. I mean, there are ways of spinning a meteoric rise in government and a quick exit in a most positive way. My guess is it'll be more entertainment value, which probably will disappoint the Democrats a little bit. But if you can sort of dodge that TV commercial in the making situation, I think you'd be considered very successful. But I doubt it. I'm going south on this one. I think I think this is going to be a circus, and it's worth tuning in to Bloomberg to watch it happen.
Oh, see, now I'm excited. Rick, yes, indeed. We just got our first view of the Oval. They're setting up the desk. Someone's going to be seated. That'll be Donald Trump, presumably. Where Elon Musk ends up is another question. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, a great panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors. We count down about 10 minutes to the start of this event. Assuming it's on time, we'll bring it to you live here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Charlie Pellet here in New York with us. Thank you so much as we await here on Bloomberg TV and radio the beginning of a joint news conference between President Donald Trump and outgoing DOGE leader Elon Musk, who is wrapping up his time as a special government employee. This media event, of course, meant to commemorate that, perhaps take a victory lap, but it also may be an opportunity for the press to ask some questions, both Elon Musk and President Trump, on un-DOGE-related issues, like maybe getting some clarity from President Trump as to what exactly he meant when he posted on True Social this morning that China has totally violated its agreement with us, the U.S., of course, being us, so much for being Mr. Nice Guy. Still looking for clarity as to what exactly the violation China has committed here is, Joe, and how this factors into efforts to advance a trade deal between the U.S. and China.
No more Mr. Nice Guy. That's right. The markets didn't like that message. But this also comes Kailey, just hours after a federal appeals court turned over the federal trade court ruling that had the markets reacting as well yesterday, the push and pull here, the confusing headlines continue. Now the tariffs are restored, at least temporarily. And so there are great questions about how businesses are supposed to weather this kind of uncertainty. Of course, the same we can ask about investors. And I'm glad to say we're joined here in New York by John Denton, the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Secretary, it's great to see you. Thanks for being with us here in New York. The ICC represents over 45 million businesses in over 170 countries. What are they supposed to do?
Well, first of all, it's great to be the prelim for President Trump and Elon Musk press conference. And if we want to be sort of zeroed in, I'm happy to participate in that discussion as well, because the message I would be giving is the same as I'd giving you guys here. I mean, we've just surveyed the whole of the ICC, and what we're finding is, and I don't think you'll be surprised, uncertainty actually is a tax. And so what we're seeing on a global basis is heightened levels of uncertainty. And in a way, the decision of the court, the CIT yesterday and the other jurisdiction that there was a matter heard in, doesn't actually reduce the uncertainty. It actually clouds it even further. Because what we're seeing now is a lack of consistency. There will be changes in the coherence about the frameworks that will be applied. And what that says to business, large and small, is let's just steady on. Let's take our time. Why don't we delay? There's no cost to delay in a way. And of course, what we're seeing are things being, basically kicked down the road for another 3 months, which will generally mean for another 6 months. And what that also means is some things kicked down the road won't be picked up again. So we are seeing that on a global basis. Of course, there's different levels of uncertainty operating. There's a lot more interest and uncertainty because people are much more sort of zeroed in here in advanced economies. In developing and emerging economies, particularly I've just been in Africa, it's really partly bewilderment, not quite certain why we're being wrapped up in this sort of stuff as well. But also, we don't have the resources to worry about it. We also have other stuff just to get done.
Sure.
And so people just continue on. But what you're starting to see are basically people saying, let's just not hire that additional person or keep that open. It's interesting that the two matters, or the matters that were actually heard in the various courts on this issue, came from small businesses. What that tells you is small businesses are really feeling this as well. And they do not have the resources that large businesses have, that it can't do war rooms, they don't do scenario planning. It's just problematic. And even for large businesses, this is very complicated.
Well, so when you say businesses, whatever the size, are largely just kind of wait and see mode still, are we seeing any kind of material reorientation of supply chains, thinking about shifting their sources of supply or where they are looking for end markets for things that they are exporting? What kind of decisions are businesses willing to make?
Well, the first thing, people are looking at this, but as they don't know yet what the final outcome will be, a lot of it's exploratory, and also to commit now and to discover that subsequently the actual tariff that was levied is actually unable to be levied and are going to be repaid. It's kind of like, let's just hold off here. I mean, I've just been in Mexico with the business community and government there, which we're working with them saying, well, hold on, we do know this with Mexico tariffs, USMCA, that any good that is USMCA compliant will actually not have to pay any tariffs. And we also know as a fact that only 49% of goods from Mexico into the US are currently USMCA compliant. But that's actually not because the goods aren't. It's just the cost of compliance outweighed the benefits. They paid an extra 2.5% on the tariff for that. But now they're going to go up. We're looking at, there are things we can do. We can actually lower the cost of compliance. I mean, the ICC will create a tool or apparatus to enable that to happen. So businesses are looking with this mix of friction about how they can work their way through it, but committing new capital or reorienting your supply chain, that becomes quite difficult at this point in time.
You said something really interesting right off the bat, that uncertainty is a tax. We keep talking to economists who are trying to drive home the point that a tariff is a tax. So is this approach effectively a double tax on your members?
Well, I mean, the double tax regime, we should all try to avoid that.
Yeah.
But effectively, uncertainty is a tax, because the cost of things goes up as you delay. And of course, a tariff is a tax. I don't think there's any disputing about that. The question, I think people are arguing, who pays the tax?
Yeah, well that's right.
The end, what we're seeing, even in the US economy, is consumers are going to pay that tax, and they're starting to pay that tax because you're starting to see in supply chains, you're starting to see in retail increases in costs. So, and we're seeing the sentiment move towards inflationary pressure. So that tax is going to come through and be felt by people.
Well, so when we consider the idea that President Trump says, whatever, if you want to call it a tax or what have you, it's going to bring more revenue to the U.S. But the other goal of this entire thing is to bring more business to the U.S., to have companies investing in manufacturing capacity here, making things in America rather than elsewhere. And I wonder what you're hearing from businesses in the international community about their desire to come to the United States, given this uncertainty that we're talking about.
Well, let me be 100% clear. This is the greatest economy in the world. Of course, if you're a business person, you want to have a piece of this, and you want to have more of it if you possibly can, and you want to invest in it. I mean, I'm an Australian. Australians invest heavily in the US. But what we want to know are what are the rules around which we can actually make these allocations of significant amounts of capital. If the rules are not clear, the actual risk factor goes up and the cost of capital goes up. We applaud 100% any government seeking to improve the conditions that will enable investment to actually occur. I mean, I want more in Australia. I actually want more in Africa. We applaud that. But the way you attract capital and businesses is by having clarity around what the rules are and also how you enforce the contracts that you're entered into. That's what we want. And that I'm sure is part of President Trump's vision.
Well, this is interesting. And I can't imagine what it's like to be in 2025, in the age of the second Trump administration, the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce, with the comments we hear about globalism coming from not just the White House, but the MAGA community, the populist community that elected him. Do you feel like you're on an island as the face of globalism?
No, I mean, the world is so interconnected. It's just, you may, the way you describe it may change a little bit.
Is he on an island in a world of globalism?
Well, there's one thing that's for sure. The US is one of the most connected economies in the world. So the president does not sit on an island. He sits on one of the most connected economies in the world. And that's actually one of the great strengths of the US economy. In any issue about balance of power, the most connected economy will be the most powerful economy. So we hope that will continue. But the reality is planes still need to fly across borders. That's part of globalization. Mail gets delivered. You require multilateral agreements. That all happens. Let's not forget that the plumbing is still there. What we might call it might be different. But also there is actually a fair point the president makes, which I think we actually share as well. We need to make certain there are more winners out of the process of opening borders and enabling trade to take place across borders. But what we also know is that this has been one of the great enablers of economic development in the last 100 years. The reason we've been able to move Africa a long way out of poverty is because they're part of a multilateral or a trading system that functions. The reason we've actually seen a decline in poverty globally is because we actually have got rules-based trading systems operating. Nobody wants to see that go. And I tell you what, the US accounts for 13% of global trade. The 87% of the rest want to keep this going. And one of our jobs is to keep it going.
Well, you've brought up Africa a few times now, which obviously is seen as kind of a landscape of competition between the U.S. and China as to who can gain the foothold in Africa. Are you seeing evidence of companies anywhere, not just in Africa, but businesses looking to reorient themselves more toward China and away from the United States? As you talk about the U.S. being the biggest, most connected, powerful economy in the world, do you see risk that the U.S. could easily cede that to the second largest economy currently?
But I think the reality is over the last 10, 20 years, there's been a reorientation of trade anyway. There's a lot more what's called South-South trade. And of course, what we see now as the major trading partner for a lot of even Latin American countries is actually China, if it's not one or two. But what's really interesting is if you want functioning economies, you want a market-based system which is governed by a political system which is effective. Market-based economies actually lead to more economic development. One of the greatest calling cards for democracy is actually effective market-based systems. And of course, the greatest alignment on democracy is with countries like the US, Australia, European Union. They're not with state-led economic models. So the more we can encourage economic development, and frankly, the point I've been making in Africa, and I've been honoured to meet with President Ruto, I've also been in South Africa because I'm part of the G20, B20 process, is that the development assistance economic model is really diminished now. It's got to be replaced by something, and that's got to be the private sector-led model. And frankly, I think we're at one with the new US administration on that as well.
This has been fascinating. I hope you'll let us know when you're back in the U.S. We should continue this conversation.
Thanks very much. Are we being knocked off now for the
No,
Trump
God forbid.
Looks like they're going to start a little late.
Absolutely.
We just
Thank you
have to
so
take
much.
a break. But it was great speaking with you, John Denton, Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce, here with us at our global headquarters in New York. We very much appreciate the time. But as John just pointed out, we are still waiting with our eyes on the White House for President Trump to take a seat, take a stand next to Elon Musk inside the Oval Office. The optics, of course, remain a question, but we are expecting them to talk about the work of the Department of Government Efficiency, and we'll be bringing that to you live when that begins. So stick with us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
Welcome back to Balance of Power, live from Bloomberg Global Headquarters in New York today. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu. Well, we still have our eye on Washington, specifically on the White House, as we are expecting any minute from now a press conference to begin with President Trump and Elon Musk, the world's richest man and outgoing leader of the Department of Government Efficiency, as he wraps up his time leading the DOGE. They're going to take a bit of a victory lap any minute now. But we also wanted to consider the actual math behind that victory lap, if we're painting it as one. We spoke with Ernie Tedeschi yesterday, director of economics at Yale's Budget Lab, and began by asking him, Elon Musk, having come into this role pledging to cut $2 trillion in spending in the U.S. government, did he really get anywhere close? This is what he said.
Not even close to. So I can confidently say that we're not even close to that. It is highly uncertain what DOGE has done. I mean, I will tell you a couple things. Number one, government spending overall, even non-interest government spending, is higher than it was the last 2 years at this point in the calendar year. We don't see any meaningful decline in the top line number. There are some meaningful declines in individual agency. Obviously, USAID is way down from where it was at this point last year, but it's harder to parse out in other agencies. The last thing I would say is that, and this is a little bit more positive on the DOGE side, to the extent that there are savings in terms of federal compensation and salaries, right? Those are delayed because a lot of federal employees who were let go or took deals are still getting paid, right, on a day-to-day basis. So we can't see those savings in the meantime. As of right now, we don't see anywhere close to $2 trillion in savings, or reductions that are consistent with $2 trillion in savings. If I had to guess, I would guess that the savings might, come to more like $50 or $100 billion over 10 years.
Elon Musk in the farewell posts on X not only thanked President Trump, but went on to say that DOGE's mission will only strengthen over time. Do we have any reason to believe that's true?
I think that what Elon Musk probably found in this position is that it is very hard to administratively cut, number one, any spending at all, and number two, to cut, spending where it really actually moves the fiscal needle over time. Look, the main drivers of our unsustainable deficit and debt over the next 10 years, other than tax cuts, the lack of revenue, is growth in programs like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security in particular, and then, of course, the resulting interest increases. You can't do that with administrative cuts from an agency like DOGE. Those mandatory spending programs require action by Congress. A lot of the administrative cuts that DOGE tried to make also require action by Congress because they're cuts to congressionally mandated agencies. So look, I think that Elon Musk probably thought that there was an efficient way to get around legal process here. And it turns out that they're not. You have to get the approval of the people, the approval of Congress for a lot of these things.
Great conversation with Ernie Tedeschi. We learned a lot, the director of economics at Yale's Budget Lab, former chief economist, the White House counsel of economic advisors. Kailey, he kind of said it all. Did we get anywhere close? Not even close. He promised $2 trillion. And I believe, are we going with 16 billion? As he leaves on day 130 here, is the in fact number of dollars cut?
Yeah, the receipts have been complicated in this. It's unclear whether or not some of the programs he said he was cutting were actually things that were not cuttable in the first place or were predated contracts. And the math has always been kind of complicated. I'm sure he's going to throw some figure out there when he gets his chance to speak from the Oval Office. Although, again, that was supposed to start at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. And we are running a little bit late, it seems, at the White House.
Just imagine what's happening behind the scenes. They're taking pictures, right? Family photos. X is running wild.
Perhaps. He does he's been a frequent visitor of the White House.
Laura Davison covers this for a living and, in fact, has to not only cover the story, but corral the reporters as Bloomberg's Washington deputy bureau chief. And she's waiting along with Kailey and I, joining us right now on Balance of Power. Laura, it's great to see you. What is the celebration today? Is it about dollars cut or the sort of reformation of government here, the closure of entire agencies under Elon Musk's watch?
This is really about both men, Trump and Musk, wanting to show that they are still friends and moving forward. Both people have incentives to say that there's a good relationship and this has been maintained, despite what looked like a very rocky tenure for Musk at the White House. Musk, of course, wants to have the proximity to the president, have the ear of the president, be an advisor. His companies will still do a lot of business with the federal government going forward. And Trump and Republicans more broadly are still hoping to get some of Musk's money for their campaigns. Musk was the biggest political donor in the 2024 cycle, and they were, hoping that he would continue to donate in the midterms and then again in 2028.
Well, of course, he told Bloomberg at the Qatar Economic Forum in an interview remotely that he feels like he's kind of done in that for now, unless he sees a reason to have to spend his money. And so I wonder to what extent, Laura, you actually are expecting he's going to be taking a step back from politics entirely, or if this is just going to be in a less formalized way, if he's still going to be tight with the president, still going to be musing about policy decisions on X, still going to be weighing in on the decision-making of specific lawmakers, or is this really an Elon Musk getting ready to focus more on Tesla and SpaceX, get back to business?
It's really unclear at the moment. His shareholders, particularly at Tesla, are really hoping that he will continue to focus on the company. Obviously, a launch with SpaceX earlier this week that did not go as planned also has stakeholders in that company worried that Musk's attention has been all over the place. It's really just remarkable to think through just really the past year or so. At this time last year, Musk was not involved in the Trump campaign. It wasn't until later in the summer that he really jumped in, was giving a bunch of money, was traveling around with the president. So it's a really remarkable, turn of events. Musk had only been tangentially involved in politics until then. We could see a lot of twists and turns here just over the next year or two.
Just imagine that. It's been less than a year since he's been involved in this, Laura. That's incredible. And when you think about what the New York Times reported today in its Musk expose, that was around the time when he was on the campaign trail that he was getting much deeper into drug use, ketamine, psychedelic drugs, to the point where he was carrying around like a medicine box, they say, that was full of pills. That's coming up in this news conference, I'm guessing, today. What's going to be the reaction?
This is almost certainly going to be one of the first questions that the Musk is asked about, his drug use. He, has talked publicly about, less severe drug use in public forums in the past. Ketamine and other substances is something that has been associated with him for a long time. But this, of course, raises a lot of questions about, someone who has the ear of the president, who is, sitting in on calls with foreign leaders, is asking the president to, make certain decisions. Someone who may be impaired or under the influence, has raised a lot of national security concerns.
If we go back to the DOGE for a second, Laura, knowing that Congress, while out of session still for the Memorial Day recess, is returning to Washington next week. And our understanding is that the House is going to, in pretty short order, receive a rescissions package from the White House to actually start to formalize some of these cuts that Elon Musk has made. Do we have an understanding of what those rescissions are likely to look at, how big they're likely to be in the grand scheme of things?
Yes, this will be roughly about a $9 billion package, which just remember, Musk started out with a $2 trillion goal for DOGE, all the way down to $9 billion, really just a rounding error. This will include cuts to funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, so National Public Radio and PBS, in addition to foreign aid funding, including the funding for USAID. This, is a very, very small package and very small in scope for what, Musk's initial vision here was. Though it's clear that the USAID, that was one of the first agencies he went into wholesale, started to dismantle. That may be sort of the lasting legacy of DOGE here. It's
going to be a long day for the president. It's not just the show in the Oval Office, which I'm assuming becomes the cold open to SNL no matter what happens this weekend, Laura. He's going to U.S. Steel for what could be arguably a more important event here, in that we might learn some news about this arrangement between this partnership, as he put it, Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel. Are we getting a campaign rally tonight? What are we going to see when he gets to Pittsburgh?
This is almost certainly going to be a campaign-style rally. He'll be up in Pennsylvania. It was a swing state. Has spent a lot of time up there. Trump is very intent that this is a partnership. That whereas the Japanese have been insisted that this is a purchase, that this is that they are acquiring U.S. Steel. The details here are still quite murky. It's not clear that a deal yet has been finalized. But Trump is trying to at least sell this in what'll be a critical swing state going forward in 2028.
Well, and talk to us about the dynamics in that swing state, Laura, because when this deal was initially proposed, obviously both Trump and Biden were not for it. They suggested that this would actually harm the U.S. steel industry. But you also had folks inside the industry saying, no, we actually want this deal to happen for our own job protection. And now it seems that President Trump's framing of this has changed very much, where he's talking about this is going to create 70,000 jobs. This will make sure that the U.S. has a strong steel industry. What is behind the kind of shift in attitude around this entire deal here?
Part of it is just the economics of this deal. If he's realized that he's had both sides of in his ear saying, "Hey, look, there's some reasons for this deal to go through." You've also seen Trump in the early months of his presidency get very interested in tallying up all the sort of foreign investment in the United States he can get. He's had CEOs come to the White House, hold press conferences with him, saying, "Look, we're going to build factories, we're going to add jobs, we're going to do all of these things," and particularly in an iconic, sort of industrial industry like steelmaking. That's just something that really speaks to Trump's core. He likes to see those jobs. He likes to see those plants. And this, ultimately ended up dovetailing with his economic agenda, even if it didn't quite align with his political rhetoric on the campaign trail. Do
we have any idea what the run of show is for tonight, Laura? We're going to have steel workers up on the podium. And I'm asking that because we know that the steel workers opposed the takeover when it was proposed last year. This being framed as a partnership may go over differently. Is that possible?
It's very likely. The Trump team is very, very good about looking at the background, the optics, the people who come up on stage. Of course, Trump also likes to call people who may not be expecting to come up. So there may be a worker that he speaks to before the event. We can be certain that, members of Congress, senators from Pennsylvania will also be there. We may hear from them. And there could be, someone else. It could be a member of the Trump family, a donor, someone else. So we could see, really a show. Trump has not been able to do some of these rallies like he really enjoys them. He feeds off the crowd. He finds them to be really enjoyable. A lot of the events at the White House are much smaller. He usually does come out and speak at least once a day, but this will have the lights, the music, a nice primetime Friday night event.
Well, I wonder if China is going to work its way into his remarks somehow. It certainly worked his way into his morning musings on Truth Social, Laura, as he talked about China not abiding by the terms agreed to in Geneva when it comes to trade. No more or so much for Mr. Nice Guy is what he said, to quote him directly. Are we about to see Mr. Mean Guy come out on China? Are things taking a turn for the worse here?
It seems to be the case. What markets, I think even the Chinese, as well as, those of us in Washington are wondering is what specifically is not going well in this deal. He came out and said that the Chinese are not abiding by the terms of this deal they set out in Geneva a couple weeks ago. Jamieson Greer, the U.S. trade rep, said as much as well. Scott Bessent has said things are a little bit stalled. He's always, kind of more moderating in his comments. But it's not clear what the problem is here. This, of course, has been a very rocky situation, going back to, Trump's early days in the White House, where he was throwing on 10%, then an additional 20% tariffs on fentanyl. those rates went all the way up to 145%. Now we're back down to 30, and with the hopes of a broader deal being worked out here over the next couple months. But it seems that they have again hit a snag. This has been a recurring problem for Trump. Think Putin, think with Israel, of that he thinks that a deal is very close and that he's able to close it, only to have a more squirrely negotiating partner on the other side than he would like.
If you're just joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio, we are waiting for an event to start in the Oval Office with President Trump and Elon Musk. We thought they'd be well underway by now, having been scheduled to start around 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. We will get a news conference, and whether it happens inside this program or not, we'll bring it to you here. Laura, the idea being that he's wrapping his work as head of the DOGE, but the president says Elon Musk will continue to come to Washington, will continue to be part of the family here, I guess, in the Trump White House. We don't have a sense of what that will include, though, do we?
We don't. We've gotten a little bit of a sense of that just over the past couple weeks. It was about a month ago that he said he was really, taking a big step back from DOGE, and that he'd be in Washington maybe 1 or 2 days a week. He was going to be spending more time with his companies. This is when we really started to see bad earnings reports come out of Tesla. Of sales were way down. Investors were getting very worried. But he's still been here. When Ramaphosa, the South African head of state, was here just a few weeks ago, he was there for that meeting. He was in the Oval Office. I think we'll sort of, when there are issues that are important to Musk, we'll see him here, whether that has to do with his home country of South Africa, whether that has to do with EVs, space exploration. And remember, DOGE also continues. It is, in the executive order that created it, it's set to continue until July 4th of 2026. So there's about a year left of it. He could pop in and out. There's a woman by the name of Amy Gleason, who's the official head of it. She's more of a technocratic person at the Office of Management and Budget. But there's also DOGE staffers that are staying on. We did report yesterday that Steve Davis, who's the head of Musk's Boring Company, he is also leaving. So we could see some of these bigger names start to step away. But it's still a vehicle that's there and will be on the books for a little bit longer. If Musk wants to pop back in, he could, come back in. He'll continue to have White House access privileges. He may not have his office and his email address as he did as a special government employee, but he's got the president's phone number, and that's almost the highest ranking thing you can get.
Well, that's very true. Phone number, I guess, ice cream, middle of the night privileges, access to the Lincoln bedroom. Got a lot of things going in his relationship with President Trump. Laura, I wonder how much the legacy of DOGE is also going to be about how litigious it got, how much it was actually action we saw in the courts that were helping to make or break Elon Musk's efforts around this entire initiative.
Yeah, this is a story that is still playing out. Even just today, the Department of Transportation said that they were going to be delaying some layoffs that they had planned because this case was still being worked out in courts. Same at the Department of Labor. The total cost, both in the terms of the number of jobs, as well as whether DOGE ended up saving or costing, which is possible, the federal government money, still remains to be seen, because so much of this will be fought out for months, if not years. DOGE really only lasted 130 days, in terms of its really intense period. But the fallout here could be for months or years. You have folks, particularly in the scientific community, experts, on safety, mine safety and traffic safety, airplane safety.
Yeah. It looks like he's arrived. Laura Davison, thank you so much for spending some time with us as we bring you now, as promised, to the Oval Office a bit late. President Trump behind the desk in the Oval, Elon Musk standing at his side. This is live on Bloomberg TV and radio.
One of the people who I've respected over the years.